Okay, so let's jump right in. Could one of the most common elements on the entire planet be a silent, hidden factor in devastating brain diseases like Alzheimer's? It's a huge scientific question, a real mystery, and the story, well, it starts in some pretty surprising places.
I mean, think about it. We are literally surrounded by aluminum. It's so fundamental to our modern lives that we don't even see it anymore. But maybe we should be paying a little more attention.
And when I say common, I mean really common. Just get this. Aluminum is the third most abundant element in the Earth's entire crust. It's literally the ground beneath our feet. And, for the longest time, the thinking was, well, if it's everywhere, it's got to be harmless, right?
So where do we actually run into it? Well, pretty much everywhere. It's used to purify our water, it's in food like in baking powder, it can leach out of our cookware, but they're really concentrated doses. They can come from places like medicine. A single antacid tablet can have up to 600 milligrams. And it's also in antiperspirants and even used in some vaccines to help kickstart the immune response.
Okay, so if this stuff is everywhere and we've been using it forever, how on earth did it end up on the suspect list for brain disease? Let's dig into that shift in thinking.
For decades, the medical community wasn't just skeptical, they were openly hostile to the idea. Look at this quote from the Journal of the American Medical Association way back in 1935. They're basically calling any concerns propaganda with ulterior motives. The message was clear: move along, nothing to see here.
But the story couldn't stay that simple forever. Things started to change when these clear, really undeniable patterns began showing up in cases where people were hit with massive doses of aluminum all at once.
The real turning point was a string of just alarming events. First, in the 70s, you have dialysis patients developing this severe dementia, and it gets traced back to aluminum in their treatment fluid. Then, in the 80s, workers in the aluminum industry start reporting neurological problems. And then, the big one, in 1988, an entire town's water supply in the UK gets accidentally flooded with aluminum sulfate. It was tragic, but it became this massive, real-world case study.
In that first case, the dialysis encephalopathy was absolutely crucial.
Because this wasn't just a coincidence, a correlation. They could prove causation. How? Well, when doctors gave patients a drug that literally pulled the aluminum out of their bodies, their symptoms got better. That was it. That was the smoking gun. The first hard proof that, yep, at high enough doses, aluminum is a straight-up neurotoxin.
So, knowing that a huge dose is definitely toxic, that led scientists to a much, much bigger and honestly more disturbing question. What about the small, constant, low-level exposure that pretty much all of us get every single day?
So the case against this kind of chronic low-level exposure really comes down to three main lines of evidence. First, you've got studies of huge populations. Second, you have scientists looking at brains post-mortem. And third, of course, controlled experiments on animals. And what's interesting is that all three of these different angles have started to point toward a pretty troubling connection, a connection between aluminum and the kinds of changes you see in the brains of Alzheimer's patients.
And this evidence has led some researchers to make some, incredibly bold statements. Take this quote from a 2011 paper. It says, aluminum might be the single most aggravating and avoidable factor related to Alzheimer's. That's not a small claim. They're saying it could be the biggest environmental piece of the puzzle that we can actually do something about.
So, what's the theory? How could this actually be happening in the body? Well, researchers have laid out a pretty plausible pathway. It goes something like this. Step 1, aluminum gets into our bodies from all those sources we talked about. Step 2, a teeny tiny fraction of it manages to sneak past the blood-brain barrier and just accumulates. It builds up over years. Step 3, once it's in the brain, it acts like a constant low-level irritant. It keeps the brain's immune cells, these things called glial cells, switched on. Step 4, this leads to chronic, low-grade inflammation that just never turns off. And finally, step 5, that constant inflammation is thought to speed up the brain's aging process, which could make it way more vulnerable to diseases like Alzheimer's.
Okay, so that's the theory. But how do you actually test something like that in a lab? Let's zoom in on one specific experiment to see how scientists are tackling this. All right, check out this study from 2018. They used rats, and the setup is super clean. You've got your control groups, they just get a simple saline solution, and then you have your treatment groups getting a small daily dose of aluminum chloride. The key here is they looked at two different timelines, a short one, 30 days, and a longer one, 90 days.
Now, here's where it gets weird. The results, especially the behavioral ones, were not what you might expect. After 30 days, the rats getting aluminum were actually more active, like hyperactive. But then, by the 90-day mark, their activity level went right back to normal. It's a hint that the body's response to this stuff is complicated, and it definitely changes over time.
And this right here is the biggest puzzle to come out of that study. At the 30-day mark, everything made sense. The more aluminum you found in a rat's blood, the more you found in its brain. Simple, clear correlation. But fast forward to 90 days, and that connection just vanished. It was gone. The link between blood levels and brain levels was totally broken. What does that mean? Well, maybe the brain adapts. Or maybe the systems that transport aluminum into the brain just get maxed out. It's a really fascinating wrinkle in the story.
And it's these kinds of complicated, unexpected results that are a huge reason why this whole topic is still a really fierce and totally unresolved scientific debate.
Let me just put it plainly, there is no consensus here. None. For every single study that suggests there's a link, you can go find another one that says there isn't. You have brilliant scientists looking at the exact same body of evidence and coming to polar opposite conclusions. So on one side of the debate, you've got researchers saying, look, the evidence for a causal link is just, it's not there, it's too weak. They point to something called the Bradford-Hill criteria, which is basically the gold standard checklist for proving one thing causes another in science. And they say the case for aluminum just doesn't check the boxes.
And yet, on the other side of the aisle, you have other scientists who look at the very same evidence, the very same criteria, and they come to the conclusion that, yes, actually, the criteria have been met. It's just a fundamental disagreement on how you interpret the data we have.
So you have to ask, why is this so incredibly difficult to prove one way or the other? Well, a few reasons. First, diseases like Alzheimer's can take decades to develop. How do you isolate one single environmental factor over a person's entire lifetime? It's almost impossible. And second, you can't exactly run a controlled experiment on humans for 50 years. It's just not ethical. And as we saw with that rat study, the body's response isn't simple or linear, which makes it even harder to track.
So, after wading through all of this, all the history, the studies, the debate, what's the final verdict?
The truth is, the verdict is still out. The jury is not back on this one. We have a lot of compelling evidence, a lot of smoke, that points toward a link, but it just hasn't reached that level of conclusive, definitive proof. For now, the mystery of aluminum and the brain, it continues.
And that leaves us with one last big question to think about. Whether aluminum turns out to be a major culprit, a minor player, or totally innocent, this whole investigation really shines a spotlight on a much bigger issue. What other everyday things in our environment could be quietly shaping the future of our brains?